They said it was the will of God, that if you left your land, your wife, your children, and took up the cross, every sin would be forgiven, that you'd walk through the gates of heaven with blood on your hands and a crown on your head. But no one warned you about the lice, the boils, the stench, the screaming, the madness that would creep into your soul long before you ever saw a battlefield. Imagine being a poor farmer in northern France. You've never left your village. You barely have shoes. You don't know where Jerusalem is, let alone how to reach it. But one day, a stranger arrives, dusty, loud, surrounded by chanting priests and shaking relics in the air. He says the world is ending, that Christ is calling you to save his tomb, that if you join, you will become a soldier of heaven. If you don't, you're siding with the devil. It wasn't a question, it was spiritual blackmail. In villages from Germany to Italy, people dropped their tools mid-harvest. Some sold everything. Others abandoned sick parents or newborns. The promise was too great. Fight, and your soul is saved. Stay, and you'll rot in sin. This wasn't war. It was mass hypnosis laced with holy fire. And for many, it started with a fiery sermon. Men like Peter the Hermit, a ragged preacher on a mule shouting apocalyptic verses, could summon crowds of thousands in town squares. He didn't just preach, he ignited people. He painted Muslims as monsters. He said God was weeping, that angels had appeared in visions, and that the Holy Land was soaked in Christian blood. He wasn't alone. Bishops, monks, and nobles all joined in. They weren't just recruiting soldiers, they were harvesting desperation. The Crusades didn't begin with knights in shining armor. They began with barefoot believers who barely knew how to hold a sword. Most weren't trained. Many didn't even have proper clothing for the cold or the heat. Some didn't understand Latin. But they all understood one thing. God had issued a command. So they went. Not because they were brave, not because they wanted to kill, but because they were terrified of eternal damnation. Before you leave, I want to know, where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now in your country? Drop your city and the hour down in the comments. I read every single one. And if you felt something during this journey, don't forget to subscribe. There's a lot more history waiting for you. What followed was chaos in divine disguise. Men, women, and children walked for weeks, then months. Some joined what became known as the People's Crusade. Tens of thousands led by Peter the Hermit himself. They didn't wait for the official armies. They moved like a river of bodies, unarmed and unready, toward a destiny none of them could imagine. Within days, hunger set in. They begged, they stole, they turned on each other. Entire groups starved to death before crossing the first mountain range. Some believed the suffering was holy, that each blister, each drop of blood, was proof of their devotion. Others whispered doubts, but dared not speak them aloud. The church had given them armor no steel could match. Fear. And then there were the lice. They came with the filth. Bodies pressed together for weeks without baths. Blankets shared by dozens. Camps where food was rotting and water was scarce. Men scratched until they bled. Women lost their hair in clumps. Children cried at night, their skin raw and crawling. Some swore they saw demons in the night. Others began to speak in tongues, claiming visions. But these weren't miracles. They were symptoms of infection, fever, and malnutrition. Many died long before ever meeting an enemy. And yet the preachers kept going. It's the devil testing us, they'd say. God is purifying us through pain. But what they called purification looked a lot like agony without purpose. No military strategy, no maps, just blind faith and burning feet. Entire groups disappeared on the road, slaughtered by locals who saw them as invaders, poisoned by bad water, devoured by illness, and still, more came. Because back home, the message never changed. If you die on the road to Jerusalem, you wake up in heaven. It didn't matter if you died screaming in a ditch, covered in boils, with your last breath begging for mercy. The promise was the same, and promises like that turned suffering into sacrifice. But not everyone believed. In towns along the way, some priests and nobles warned against the frenzy. They saw it for what it was, a dangerous mix of spiritual manipulation and mass desperation. Some locked their gates, others sent letters to Rome begging for restraint. But their voices were drowned in the roar of thousands chanting, Deus vult, God wills it. Even children weren't spared. In later waves, literal children's crusades were launched. Tens of thousands of boys and girls, some as young as 7, convinced that God would part the seas for them. They never reached Jerusalem. Most were sold into slavery or died along the coast. This wasn't divine victory. It was systemic collapse, fueled by unchecked faith and unrelenting hunger. And all the while, the lice spread. It's easy to imagine the Crusades as battles with flags and armor, but for the common man, the war started in his own skin, his own gut, his own mind. God was supposed to guide him, but what he found on the road was rot, madness, and sermons that promised paradise while delivering plague. Still, they marched. Because once you believe your pain is holy, you stop asking why it hurts. They marched because they believed, or because they were too far from home to turn back. Either way, the journey had begun, and nothing in their lives had prepared them for what they were about to endure. Maps were meaningless to most of them. These were peasants who didn't even know the full borders of their own regions. Directions were handed down like rumors, passed from one blistered foot to another. The sun became the compass, hunger became the clock. The People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit and a patchwork of fiery preachers and ragged warriors, was never meant to be a military force. It was a wave of bodies driven by desperation and divine promises. They set out from France and Germany, some even from as far as England, dreaming of Jerusalem, with no idea that it would take over a year on foot to reach it, if they survived at all. Within weeks, food began to disappear. The dried bread turned to dust in their hands. Cheese molded in their packs. Salted meat spoiled in the heat. Entire groups had to share a single loaf, soaked in dirty water just to make it chewable. Many boiled roots or grass. Others stripped bark from trees. The strong began to hoard. The weak began to beg. And all of them grew thinner by the day. The terrain showed no mercy. First the forests of Central Europe, dense and damp, crawling with insects and disease. Then the plains of Hungary, where locals watched them pass with suspicion, sometimes locking their gates, sometimes looting the looters. And then the mountains, those cruel slabs of rock and snow that broke backs, shattered ankles, and swallowed the sick. These weren't trained armies moving in formation. These were barefoot pilgrims climbing with bloodied palms and prayers on their lips. They drank from streams tainted with animal waste. Many were too thirsty to care. Cholera swept through camps like wildfire. People vomited in the mud. Children wailed for water that would only make them sicker. Fever took hold. The smell of death began to follow the crowd. Still, they kept walking, because somewhere far ahead, they believed salvation waited. In the searing heat of what is now Turkey, the march turned biblical in its brutality. Men fainted mid-step, landing face first in the dust. Women carried infants with sun-cracked lips, whispering hymns to keep the flies away. Priests called it the trial of the faithful. But what they endured had no name that did it justice. And then there were the sermons. Every time morale dipped, after a village turned them away, after another child died in the night, someone would step up. A monk, a preacher, a self-proclaimed prophet. They'd shout scripture from atop carts, raising crosses, calling the suffering proof of God's favor. "The devil tests us," they'd yell. "Only the faithful shall endure." People cheered. Some wept. Some just stared with blank eyes, rocking back and forth, chewing what little bread they had left as if it were made of gold. The sermons weren't just religious. They were hypnotic, and in them people found a reason to keep moving. But belief can only push the body so far. One German group, over 15,000 strong, reached the edge of Byzantine territory, convinced they were about to fight for Jerusalem. Instead, they clashed with locals, misunderstood orders, and wandered into ambushes. Hundreds died before even crossing into enemy lands. The Byzantines, allies on paper, were horrified at what the Crusaders had become. Unwashed mobs burning fields and stealing livestock in the name of Christ. These weren't knights. They were starving pilgrims with delusions of holy power, and the violence was spreading. In some towns along the route, Crusaders began to turn their swords inward. Jewish communities, completely unrelated to the conflict in the Holy Land, became scapegoats. In cities like Worms and Mainz, entire populations were massacred by so-called pilgrims. Women were dragged into the streets. Men were forced to convert or die. Synagogues were torched. No orders had been given. It was pure fanaticism, boiling over in the absence of leadership or logic. The road to Jerusalem was already soaked in blood, long before a single battle with a Muslim army had taken place. For those still alive, the march became something else. It wasn't just a journey anymore, it was survival against everything. The heat, the hunger, the disease, and now each other. Supplies meant for pilgrims were taken by force. Disputes broke out over scraps. Entire families were killed for a pot of boiled grain. And the further they went, the more alien the world became. Language shifted. Local dialects gave way to strange tongues. Villagers saw them as invaders, not saviors. They were pelted with rocks, blocked at bridges, poisoned with false directions. Some crusaders began to disguise themselves, hiding their crosses, pretending to be merchants. Others doubled down, believing their suffering was the price of divine reward. But reward never came. Peter the Hermit, once seen as a prophet, was now overwhelmed. His followers begged for guidance, but he could offer none. They reached the walls of Constantinople broken, filthy, and desperate. The Byzantine emperor, shocked by the sight of them, allowed them passage, but insisted they wait for the official crusader armies. They didn't. Fueled by impatience and blind zeal, thousands pushed onward into Anatolia. There, in a land they didn't understand, they met Turkish forces who knew the terrain, the tactics, and how to crush chaos. It was a slaughter. Entire bands of crusaders were annihilated in ambushes, their bodies left to rot in the sun, women taken as slaves. Survivors scattered into forests, wandering without food or purpose. Peter himself fled back to Constantinople. The People's Crusade was over. Less a military expedition, more a human tragedy painted in the colors of faith. And still, the real crusade hadn't even begun, because behind them, the official armies, well-armed, well-fed, led by nobles, were just beginning to gather. And when they came, the suffering of the poor would only grow deeper. By the time the official Crusader armies began to move around 1096, they found not glory, but a road already littered with corpses, silence, and the distant stench of failure. The People's Crusade had been devoured by its own hunger and delusion, and those who survived barely spoke of what they'd seen. But for the ones just beginning their march, nobles, mercenaries, and the few civilians who dared follow, there was still the illusion of purpose. And yet, even with more structure, more weapons, more supplies, the journey was no less cruel. Because the land didn't care who led the army, the mountains didn't yield for banners, the sun didn't show mercy for noble blood, and the wind carried no prayers, only dust and disease. Each step eastward felt like walking away from humanity itself. The deeper into unknown lands the Crusaders went, the more alien the world became. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The landscape shifted violently. Green hills gave way to dry plains, rivers thinned into trickles, and every village looked more hostile than the last. Water was the first obsession, then salt, then shade. Marching for 10 hours under a Turkish sun, men collapsed mid-stride. Some foamed at the mouth. Others tore off pieces of their armor and flung them into the bushes, no longer able to bear the heat trapped beneath the steel. Horses died by the dozens, their bodies left to bloat and burst by the roadside. The stink was overwhelming, and where there were corpses, there were flies, thousands of them. They swarmed into tents, covered eyes, found their way into open mouths. They weren't a nuisance, they were a plague. Soldiers began to sleep, sitting up, swatting through the night. Waking up meant dealing with sweat-soaked blankets, blistered feet, and the sound of someone coughing blood nearby. Dysentery, typhus, and dehydration didn't wait for battles. They attacked in the dark, in silence, turning once strong men into trembling husks. Some bled out in their sleep, others begged for death with cracked lips. Food devolved into a ritual of shame. The early days had salted pork, dried legumes, wine. But weeks on the road turned those into memory. Now they boiled horse bones for broth, chewed leather, picked bugs from stale grain. In some cases, they dug up the soil where others had cooked, hoping to find crumbs. And yet, every few days, like clockwork, came the sermons. This was no longer Peter the Hermit's chaos. Now it was organized spiritual conditioning, delivered by bishops in gleaming robes, standing on carts while the masses crouched in dust. They spoke of endurance, of Christ's suffering, of the cleansing power of pain, but they also spoke of glory, of the Holy Land's riches, of the women and wine waiting in Jerusalem. They dangled paradise like a prize just out of reach. And in between those promises, they reminded every man, if you die on this road, your soul flies to heaven. So even when men vomited blood or passed worms in their stools, they pressed forward. Even when women fainted in the sun or miscarried by the roadside, the army marched. Even when children vanished in the night, lost, stolen, or worse, no one stopped. Because the voice in their heads wasn't just the priests. It was God's, or so they believed. And belief is a powerful anesthetic. Still, the physical toll was beyond imagination. The soldiers weren't machines. Their skin cracked, their joints swelled, their eyes grew sunken. Some began to hallucinate, visions of saints in the smoke of fires, demons in the shape of birds. A man in raiment of Toulouse's contingent reportedly walked into the desert after claiming the Virgin Mary had told him the sands would part like the Red Sea. He was never seen again. All right, now it's your turn. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Let's fill the comments with stories from every corner of the world. And if this video made you think or feel something new, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. They called these moments divine. They were more likely the result of heat stroke and starvation, but no one questioned it, because questioning was blasphemy. And blasphemy got you tied to a tree and left behind. Those who kept journals or chronicled the crusade described entire camps echoing with coughing, vomiting, moaning. The stench was so thick, some men wore cloths over their faces just to eat. Diseases moved faster than horses. Boils opened on thighs, skin peeled from feet. Some crusaders had to be carried by servants, too weak to walk, but too afraid to be left behind. And the worst wasn't the hunger or the heat. It was the silence, the eerie stillness that followed each death, the absence of birds in the trees, the moment before a village came into view, when everyone held their breath, wondering, are they allies? Will they feed us? Or will they kill us on sight? In the Balkans and Anatolia, many locals saw the Crusaders as a threat, not a holy mission. And who could blame them? Armies of thousands meant burned fields, emptied wells, stolen animals. Some towns sent envoys with wine and bread, others sent arrows. A few tricked crusaders into walking into dead ends, then ambushed them for their gear. One night, a unit from Bohemond of Taranto's army stopped at what looked like an abandoned village. Tents were pitched, fires were lit, but at dawn the water barrels had been poisoned. 30 men died before noon. This was the new rhythm of the journey: sweat, hope, poison, sermons, silence. And then there were the sermons again, because nothing could be done without reminding the masses, God sees your suffering, and he is pleased. They even turned the weather into a message. When it rained, it was God's mercy. When it didn't, it was the devil's test. When food arrived, it was a miracle. When it spoiled, it was a punishment for sin. People adapted, not by growing stronger, but by growing number. Superstitions exploded. Some soldiers carried bits of bone from dead comrades as holy relics. Others wore symbols etched in their own blood, believing it protected them from arrows. A woman in one caravan claimed to have visions from St. George. Crowds followed her for weeks until she collapsed and died of infection. Still, they pressed on, because in the distance, behind all the pain, the sermons, the silence, lay a city most had never seen, Jerusalem. And the closer they got, the more they believed that everything, every scar, every loss, would be redeemed. By the time the Crusaders reached the edge of Islamic lands, they weren't warriors. They were shadows of themselves. But what they lacked in strength, they compensated for with something far more dangerous: hunger wrapped in righteousness. Starvation had twisted their morals. Suffering had stripped away their humanity. Now, with swords in hand and sermons still echoing in their ears, they arrived at the gates of cities they couldn't pronounce, with fire in their eyes and blood already on their hands. From the beginning, this war was painted as sacred, but for those marching under the cross, the lines between holy duty and personal vengeance blurred quickly. When food ran out, they didn't pray. They pillaged. When their own supplies failed, they turned to the villages in their path. Christian, Muslim, Jewish, it didn't matter. If the people had bread, they were enemies. If they resisted, they were slaughtered. And if they begged, their cries were drowned out by war chants. This wasn't liberation. It was chaos in the name of God. One of the most infamous moments came at the siege of Antioch. A magnificent walled city controlled by the Seljuk Turks, Antioch was a key point in the Crusaders' path toward Jerusalem, but it wasn't easy to breach. The siege dragged on for months. Food dwindled, horses were eaten, rats became a delicacy. Men drank from stagnant puddles, gnawed on leather, and prayed not for victory, but for something to chew. And then they broke through, not by strength, but by betrayal. A local Christian inside the city opened one of the towers in exchange for gold. The Crusaders poured in like a flood. And what followed wasn't a battle, it was a purge. Men, women, and children were butchered in the streets, heads rolled, fire spread. Churches were not spared, nor mosques. One chronicler wrote that blood ran ankle-deep in the markets. Some soldiers claimed to see visions of angels fighting beside them. Others said they were possessed by the Holy Spirit. But the truth was simpler. They had become beasts with scripture in their mouths. And it didn't stop at Antioch. When Jerusalem finally came into sight, after nearly 3 years of marching, bleeding, and believing, it appeared not as a city, but as a symbol. Everything they had endured pointed toward this place. Every sermon, every wound, every buried comrade had been for this moment. They laid siege, they prayed, they starved again. And then, one July morning in 1099, they broke through its defenses. What followed became one of the bloodiest episodes in medieval history. The city was full of people: Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, merchants, elders, children. Many believed the Crusaders would accept surrender, that some mercy would be shown. Instead, they unleashed what some modern historians describe as religious genocide. Muslims were dragged from their homes and executed in the streets. The Jewish quarter was set on fire, with families still inside the synagogues. Some women were raped before being killed. Priests who begged for peace were cut down without hesitation. No house was spared, no child was spared. Blood coated the walls. One French chronicler, writing with eerie pride, claimed that the Crusaders rode their horses through rivers of blood that reached their stirrups. And then, after the killing, they prayed. They walked barefoot to the church of the Holy Sepulchre. They wept. They sang hymns. They knelt in the blood of those they had just murdered and thanked God for the victory. To them, this wasn't a contradiction. It was fulfillment. The sermons had said, God is testing you. God is purifying you. God will reward you. And this mountain of corpses and burning homes, was, in their minds, the reward. But not everyone rejoiced. Among the few literate Crusaders, some began to write letters home, some boasting of the glory, others quietly haunted. One knight described Jerusalem as a furnace of smoke and bone. Another wrote that he no longer recognized his own face. These weren't conversions. They were confessions from men who had stared too long into the fire and begun to see themselves inside it. What most people forget is that the First Crusade didn't end with Jerusalem's fall, because the Crusaders didn't leave. They stayed. They occupied. They turned holy ground into military outposts. They carved up the land into petty kingdoms and handed power to European nobles who barely spoke the local languages. They forced their customs, built their castles, taxed the locals, and justified all of it as divine order. But they were surrounded. The Muslim world, shocked by the brutality of the Crusader campaign, began to rally. Word of the massacres spread like wildfire. Anger festered. Resentment hardened into resolve. The Crusaders had won their prize, but they were now foreign rulers in hostile territory, and the people they ruled had not forgotten the rivers of blood. Yet even then, the Crusaders didn't reflect. They built churches, held Mass, declared their survival proof that God favored them. Some even sent letters back to Europe encouraging others to come. "There is gold in the streets," one man wrote, "and heaven smiles on us here." But heaven, if it was watching, was silent. And beneath the ashes of Jerusalem, a new kind of fire had begun to burn, one that would soon consume the conquerors in a wave of vengeance that even their sermons couldn't silence. Jerusalem had fallen. The blood had dried. The hymns had faded into the stone walls, and still the Crusaders remained. They had come from distant lands, dragging their bodies in faith across continents, driven by a singular promise: salvation through sacrifice. But now that the city was theirs, the fantasy of holy conquest began to rot in the heat. What they had won with swords and sermons began to eat them from the inside. They didn't go home. Most couldn't. Some had no homes to return to. Villages destroyed by famine, families lost on the road, debts unpaid. Others stayed because they believed Jerusalem had become heaven's doorstep. They had bathed in fire and come out blessed. But the truth was far less divine. The kingdom of Jerusalem, carved out of blood and ash, was a ghost kingdom from the start. Crusader lords divvied up lands they didn't understand, ruling over locals they couldn't communicate with. Language barriers turned every interaction into a potential insult. Religious differences hardened into policy. Every mosque became a church. Every local was either a subject or a suspect. They built walls, literal and metaphorical. But walls don't stop disease, they don't grow food, and they don't keep you warm at night when your body is breaking. The Crusaders, once a mass of the faithful, were now settlers. And life in Jerusalem was not the divine reward they'd been promised. The sun scorched the earth. Wells ran dry. Crops failed. Rats returned. Fevers came back with a vengeance. And the worst enemy wasn't the Turk or the Arab. It was dysentery. Chronic, relentless, humiliating. Soldiers who had once stormed citadels now defecated in alleys, trembling and hollowed. Boils returned. Scabies spread. The same armor that once shone in the name of Christ now rubbed skin raw, blackened by rot, crawling with lice. Death, once heroic in battle, became pitiful and silent in dark corners, far from the church of the Holy Sepulchre. Even the nobility wasn't spared. Count Raymond of Toulouse, one of the original leaders of the First Crusade, spent his final days in agony, vomiting and shivering in a makeshift tent. His death wasn't glorious. It was slow. His prayers offered no comfort. His wealth bought no cure. He was far from alone. Survivors of the initial siege found themselves surrounded by enemies, some visible, others growing within their own camp. Rival crusader lords turned on each other. Disputes over land, women, taxes, and religious relics tore alliances apart. Infighting wasn't just common, it became the norm. Crusaders who once knelt side by side at Mass were now ambushing each other's patrols, poisoning each other's wells, burning each other's tents under the cover of darkness. Unity had died the moment the real battle ended. Outside the walls, Muslim resistance hardened. The atrocities committed during the conquest, massacres in Jerusalem, Antioch, Ma'arat al-Numan, were not forgotten. In fact, they were retold, not as trauma, but as fuel. For the Islamic world, the Crusaders weren't holy warriors. They were monsters in foreign mail, speaking a savage tongue, and wielding swords in the name of a cruel god. And now they were targets. Raids began almost immediately. Supply routes were attacked, farms burned, scouts vanished. Entire Crusader caravans disappeared into the hills, never to return. Roads were no longer safe. Trade with Europe slowed. Reinforcements dried up. The dream of Jerusalem was cracking under the weight of reality. Inside the city, things turned darker still. The kingdom needed soldiers, but few were willing to join from Europe now that the initial glory had faded. So they turned to desperate measures. Prisoners were given choices: convert and fight or die. Orphans were pressed into service. Mercenaries were hired, often switching sides when paid better. Morality faded. The cross was now a brand, not a belief. Some crusaders began questioning everything. Not openly, they knew what happened to doubters, but privately, in whispered conversations, in the silence after prayer. They had bled, burned, and believed. And for what? A city of plague? A land of dust and enemies? One anonymous chronicler, likely a monk, wrote, "We came for God. We became animals. We made this place a grave for faith." Still, many stayed. Why? Because leaving meant admitting failure. Because turning back meant facing the ghosts of those they had lost along the way. Because Jerusalem wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. To abandon it would be to abandon meaning itself. And so they stayed. Building, bleeding, burning. Generation after generation of crusaders born in the East. raised on war, fed on bitterness. These children of conquest knew no other life. They spoke hybrid tongues, wore mixed clothes, practiced a twisted version of European Christianity, fused with survivalist brutality. They weren't knights, they weren't saints, they were relics in motion, half myth, half men. Some of them turned, not just spiritually, but practically. They traded with Muslim neighbors, they took local wives. They adopted Islamic medicines, architecture, even customs, quietly at first, then openly. These were the cracks in the foundation, and all the while revenge was building on the horizon. From Egypt, from Damascus, from Mosul, united armies were forming. Charismatic leaders began to rise, men like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and eventually Saladin. They had studied the Crusaders, understood their weaknesses, their arrogance, their fractured loyalties, and when they came, they didn't come with sermons. They came with strategy. But long before those great battles, before Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, before Saladin's name echoed through history, there was another truth quietly taking root. The ones who had suffered the most during the First Crusade, the poor, the peasants, the civilians, were already being erased. Their stories weren't carved into stone. Their names weren't preserved in church records. They weren't saints. They weren't kings. They were the nameless, the lice-ridden, the dead in ditches and mass graves, and yet they were the spine of the crusade. Without them, the banners would have fallen. The roads would have been empty. They were never heroes, but they were the reason any of it happened. And as the next wave of crusaders prepared to leave Europe for a land they thought was holy, they walked directly into the legacy of those forgotten souls, whose only miracle was surviving long enough to be ignored. The banners flew again. Barely a generation had passed since the First Crusade carved its bloody path to Jerusalem, and already new waves of pilgrims and warriors were being summoned from Europe. New sermons echoed through cathedrals and village squares, louder and more desperate than before. And this time, the message wasn't just salvation, it was vengeance, because news had reached Europe. Jerusalem, the prized jewel of the First Crusade, had fallen. In 1187, Saladin, the brilliant Muslim general and unifier, had taken back the city after crushing the Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin. 200 knights were captured. None were spared. The true cross, the very relic they had once carried into battle, was paraded through Muslim streets like a trophy. And now the West was enraged. The Third Crusade began as a response to humiliation. But for the common man, nothing had changed. The peasants, porters, and cooks weren't fighting for relics or revenge. They were still starving, still crawling across continents, still dying in the mud behind banners they couldn't read. The same manipulation returned, new promises, new sins forgiven, new voices, from pulpits calling the poor to carry the sins of the rich. And so they went. Again, some were veterans. Many more were too young to remember what had come before. And none of them knew what was waiting for them in the Levant. A hardened, well-organized, and deeply motivated Muslim resistance. Saladin had unified what had been fragmented. He brought discipline, tactics, and above all, patience. The Crusaders were coming, and he was ready. What followed was not the holy triumph the priests had promised. The journey to the east was still brutal. Ships sank, horses drowned. Scurvy claimed dozens on the water. On land, it was worse. Robbers, broken roads, dysentery, betrayal. Every mile toward Jerusalem was paid in bone. But this time, the brutality became institutionalized. The suffering was not random, it was strategy. The siege of Acre in 1189 made that clear. The Crusaders arrived thinking they could reclaim their lost city. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a long, grinding siege. Saladin's army surrounded them. The Crusaders besieged the city. But now they were also the besieged, caught between stone walls and steel blades. Disease spread like smoke. Camp latrines overflowed. Flies turned tents into tombs. Rotting corpses lay unburied. Some soldiers wrote that the stench was so thick they couldn't taste their food without gagging. Many simply stopped eating. The sun boiled the air. Limbs were amputated daily. Men died holding their own intestines. Some even tried to cut them out with daggers, hallucinating, screaming, whispering prayers no one answered. And still the priests preached. Still the generals promised glory. Still they were told that every cough was a trial of faith. Acre eventually fell, after nearly 2 years. The victory was hollow. The Muslim defenders had delayed the Crusaders long enough for thousands of them to die. The walls of the city were painted not with banners, but with blood, pus, and despair. And when the Crusaders took prisoners, they executed them en masse. Almost 3,000 Muslim captives, men, women, even children, were slaughtered by order of King Richard the Lionheart. The act was justified, of course. The enemy had delayed, had insulted the cross, had failed to pay ransom. It didn't matter. The truth was simple. Slaughter had become routine. For both sides, this was no longer a war of religion. It was a machine of blood, vengeance, and performance. Battles became spectacles. Executions were timed to coincide with sermons. And in the center of it all were still the forgotten, the porters, the cooks, the barefoot women washing linens stained with 1,000 wounds. There were no statues for them, no scrolls of honor, just piles of bones buried behind makeshift hospitals and broken cathedrals. By the Fourth Crusade, the mask of sanctity had completely fallen off. In 1204, instead of marching to Jerusalem, the Crusaders, bankrupt and leaderless, turned on Constantinople, the largest Christian city in the world, a city that should have been their ally. Instead, they looted it, burned its libraries, raped its women, melted down its sacred icons for coin. This was not an accident. It was a symptom of rot. The Crusades had metastasized, and for the common participants, the horror became normalized. They had spent their lives marching, burying, praying, killing. They didn't ask why the city they were burning had crosses on every door. They didn't ask why the relics they stole were familiar. All they knew was that they were starving, that the sermons told them to keep moving, that they'd already given up their lives. So why stop now? Children were born in the dust between battles. They never knew peace. Some were raised entirely in tents, learning to walk next to sword racks and learning to speak among corpses. These were not pilgrims anymore. They were orphans of ideology, products of endless warfare justified by divine silence. And yet, despite everything, more kept coming. The Fifth Crusade, the Sixth, even a children's crusade. Thousands of boys and girls sent toward Jerusalem by fanatics who claimed their innocence would win where armies failed. They never arrived. Many were sold into slavery. Others died before crossing the Alps. Their bones became part of the landscape, unnoticed, unnamed. By the time the Seventh and Eighth Crusades launched under King Louis IX of France, Europe had changed. The church was richer. The nobles were greedier. The people were exhausted. But the formula remained. Suffering promised as sacrifice, blood sold as penance, and the illusion of meaning carried like a cross too heavy to bear. And in the East, the Muslims had learned the pattern. They didn't fear the next crusade. They prepared for it. They studied it. They absorbed its tactics. They laughed at its predictability. The era of Saladin had passed, but his legacy endured. Resilience, discipline, endurance. Meanwhile, the Crusaders were repeating themselves, each campaign weaker than the last, each banner more faded, each sermon more hollow. And yet, the most tragic legacy was not what was lost. It was what had been forgotten. The original vision, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. What remained was an empire of ghosts, fields of unmarked graves, rivers choked with bones, prayers echoing off crumbling walls. 1,000 towns across the Levant still held memories, whispers in stone, scars in soil, stories told by grandmothers about the fire from the west. The Crusaders thought they brought light, but they only left shadows. And as the last waves dwindled, as the final banners fell, as the distant bells of Europe grew silent, the dust settled not on holy victory, but on a broken mirror of faith cracked beyond repair. It was supposed to end in glory, a final triumph, a cross planted high on the dome of the rock, Jerusalem shining under Christian rule, protected by God's most faithful. That had been the dream, the reason thousands marched, bled, and died over generations. But as the 13th century dragged on, what remained of the Crusader cause was something else entirely. Not a holy war, not a divine mission, but a theater of contradictions, a machine running on fumes and corpses. The last major campaigns, those led by Frederick II, Louis IX, and others, resembled more political performances than acts of faith. Kings traveled with entourages of diplomats, physicians, scholars, and scribes. Sermons still thundered, but fewer people listened. And those who did rarely acted from belief. They acted from obligation, ambition, or desperation. Europe had changed. Its cities were growing. Trade routes were expanding. Monarchs were consolidating power. The church, though still potent, had competition now. Universities, poets, scientists, skeptics. The age of blind obedience was cracking. And the Crusades, once sold as salvation, were becoming harder to justify, but not for everyone. In rural towns, where famine and plague still ruled, the idea of joining a crusade still appealed. For the landless, it offered purpose. For the indebted, it promised absolution. And for the damned, criminals, outcasts, the unwanted, it offered escape. They weren't marching toward God anymore. They were marching away from everything else. That's why, by the time Louis IX launched his Seventh Crusade in 1248, the armies that followed him were a chaotic blend of knights, mercenaries, peasants, and zealots. They headed not toward Jerusalem, but toward Egypt. It was there, they believed, the Islamic power structure could be broken. Cairo was the new key to the Holy Land. Capture it, and the rest would fall. What they found instead was their own reflection. The campaign was a disaster. Louis's army, plagued by poor logistics and disease, landed in Egypt and began its assault. The initial victory at Damietta, taking the city almost without a fight, seemed to affirm divine favor, but it was a trap. The Egyptian forces, led by the Mamluks, retreated only to lure the Crusaders deeper into unfamiliar terrain. The Nile flooded, supplies vanished, horses sank in mud, Men drowned trying to cross rivers with armor on. Entire units collapsed in swamps, eaten alive by mosquitoes, fever, and bacteria. And then came the dysentery. Again, stomach cramps turned to bloody stools. Vomiting became uncontrollable. Within weeks, thousands were too weak to hold swords. The Crusader camp stank of death and sewage. Lewis himself contracted the illness and spent days writhing in a tent, delirious, surrounded by flies and muttering priests. The Mamluks, trained and precise, attacked swiftly. They didn't just fight. They maneuvered. They waited for rain, for disease, for chaos to do half the work, and then struck. The Crusaders, weakened and disoriented, crumbled. Louis was captured. A king of France, humiliated and imprisoned, bartered for his life. He paid in silver, and with lives. The Seventh Crusade was over, but Louis returned, stubborn in his belief. Years later, he launched the Eighth Crusade, targeting Tunisia this time, hoping to convert the local ruler. He died shortly after arriving, of disease again, his body buried in foreign sand, far from Jerusalem, far from glory. That's how the Crusades ended, not with a blaze of holiness, but with kings coughing up blood on a beach. And yet the bloodlust didn't fade, because by now the idea of a crusade had become something else, detached from its origins, twisted into a tool. The church began declaring crusades not just against Muslims in the East, but against Christian heretics in Europe. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in southern France against the Cathars, was perhaps the darkest example. Entire towns were exterminated. "Kill them all," a papal legate famously said. "God will know his own." The crusade was no longer a road to Jerusalem. It was a license to kill. This mission, once cloaked in sacrifice and sanctity, had become an excuse for conquest, genocide, and theft. And yet, some still believed. In the Holy Land, the remaining Crusader states clung to life. Cities like Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli held out, fortifying their walls, begging Europe for help. Their populations shrank, their markets dried. They became militarized islands surrounded by an ocean of resistance. Every caravan was a target, every prayer a plea for survival. In Acre, the last true Crusader stronghold, life was tense. The rich lived in fortresses. The poor lived in fear. The city became a mosaic of refugees, mercenaries, spies, merchants, and monks. Paranoia ruled. Every stranger was a potential assassin, every whisper a plot. And the Mamluks were closing in. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hammer. By 1291, they made their final move. Acre was besieged. The walls held, for a while. But the Crusaders were outnumbered, fractured, and exhausted. When the Mamluks broke through, there was no mercy. Streets ran red again. Knights were cut down in churches. Women and children drowned in the harbor, trying to flee by boat. The city was obliterated. It was over. Almost 2 centuries of holy war had ended in fire, blood, and nothing. No Jerusalem, no unified Christendom, no peace, just trauma stretching across generations. But the myth persisted. For centuries afterward, Europe remembered the Crusades not as horror, but as heroism. Statues were raised, songs were written, names like Crusader were given to ships, to weapons, to children. The atrocities were buried, the suffering ignored, the complexity erased. What remained was a legend, simplified, sanctified, and used whenever convenient. But history remembers more than marble. It remembers the lice, the rotting bread, the children buried on the road to nowhere. It remembers the men who walked for months just to die coughing in the dirt, the women who saw their faith weaponized, the cities turned to ash in the name of salvation. It remembers the silence after a massacre, when even the priests could not find the words. And it remembers that what was once called God's will was often just man's greed, disguised in rote. Because in the end, the Crusades weren't about heaven. They were about what men are willing to do when they're promised they'll never have to answer for it. And when the final Crusader strongholds fell and the banners of the cross were torn from the towers of Acre, it might have seemed like the story was over. The walls had crumbled. The holy mission had failed. The last knights were either slaughtered, captured, or lost to history. But that's the thing about stories soaked in blood and sanctified with Scripture. They don't end when the bodies are buried. They echo. And the echoes of the Crusades didn't fade quietly into dust. They twisted into memory, into myth, into something far more enduring and dangerous. Because while the swords rusted and the graves filled, a new war began. One fought not on battlefields, but in the mind. For centuries after the last Crusader was driven from the Holy Land, Europe clung to the narrative of noble suffering. The sermons shifted from calls to arms to tales of martyrdom. Knights who died vomiting in the desert were remembered as saints. Cities that had been burned, looted, and violated by Christians were cast as righteous victories. The trauma of an entire region was rebranded as divine destiny. The church, which had sanctioned and often orchestrated the bloodshed, became the curator of its memory. Chronicles were copied, edited, and sanitized. The inconvenient truths, the slaughter of entire Jewish communities, the starvation of children, the massacres of fellow Christians, were softened or erased. What remained was a glorified tapestry, knights gleaming, banners flying, Jerusalem shining in the distance. But that version of history wasn't real. The real legacy of the Crusades was sickness, spiritual, physical, and cultural. In the East, the scars were deeper than architecture. They were generational. Families passed down stories of brutality. Graveyards held bones of the nameless and the innocent. Cities rebuilt themselves over the ashes. But the memory of fire lingered. Muslim scholars, poets, and historians documented the invasions in vivid, often brutal detail. For them, the Crusades weren't a chapter. They were a wound. And that wound never fully closed. It festered in language, in identity, in mistrust. The word frange, still used in Arabic to describe Europeans, carries the echo of the Frankish Crusaders, the original invaders who came not with trade or dialogue, but with steel and sermons. In Western Europe, the term Saracen would become a lazy synonym for the exotic enemy, flattening a complex, sophisticated world into a single image of opposition. The Crusades didn't just build walls on land, they built them in the human psyche. But perhaps the most tragic part of this legacy was what it did to faith itself. Religion, which had once offered solace to the dying and structure to the living, became entangled with conquest. The line between spiritual devotion and military campaign dissolved. Pilgrimage became political. Saints were chosen not for compassion, but for their ability to swing a sword. God was no longer the healer. He had become the general. And that transformation wasn't temporary. It bled into the very DNA of European imperialism. The same rhetoric used to justify killing Muslims in Jerusalem would later be used to colonize the Americas, Africa, and Asia. "We bring you the true faith," they would say. Again, "we civilize you." The cross became a shadow on maps that stretched far beyond the Mediterranean, and in many cases, it still is. But while the West glorified and weaponized the past, the East carried its memory differently, quietly, reluctantly, and with a sharp clarity. In Damascus and Cairo and Baghdad, scholars wrote of the invaders not as monsters, but as cautionary tales. They noted their disunity, their greed, their obsession with relics and rituals while neglecting justice and mercy. They saw through the mythology early. One Muslim chronicler described the Crusaders as lions in battle, but wolves among the weak. Another observed that they prayed to God while cutting throats, and wondered aloud what kind of God would listen. These insights weren't buried in time. They were passed down, generation after generation. In some cases, they were used to strengthen internal reform. In others, to fuel future conflict. Either way, the Crusades became part of a shared memory, one that shaped diplomacy, trade, architecture, literature, and above all, suspicion. Even in modern times, the language of crusade remains loaded. In 2001, when a Western leader referred to the war on terror as a crusade, the reaction across much of the Muslim world was instant and furious. Not because of politics, because of memory. Because for them, that word wasn't ancient, it was alive. It still smelled like fire and steel. It still sounded like sermons before a slaughter. It still echoed with screams from the gates of Jerusalem. But this legacy didn't only haunt the battlefield or the pulpit. It haunted the soul. Because long after the last blade was sheathed, the common people, the ones who had carried the weight, who had walked until their feet bled, who had buried their children in strange lands, were left with nothing. No land, no reward, no redemption. Their suffering had built empires, funded churches, and fed legends. But they themselves were forgotten. We don't know their names. We don't know their stories. But they were the Crusades, the peasants who marched barefoot across frozen rivers because a priest promised heaven, the mothers who watched their sons die in foreign soil, the laborers who built siege towers in swamps only to be crushed beneath them, the porters who dragged wagons of dead through streets of cities that had once been called holy. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest irony of all. The Crusades were never truly about kings or popes or generals. They were about the nameless, the ones who died for someone else's vision of salvation, the ones who believed because they had nothing else to believe in, the ones who carried a faith they never got to define. Their legacy isn't written in marble. It's written in dust, in echoes, in the silence between the lines of the history books, and in the questions we're still too afraid to ask. By the time the fires of the Crusades had burned themselves out, what remained wasn't victory. It was silence. A haunting stillness left in the wake of 2 centuries of holy war, a silence filled not with the sounds of hymns or battle cries, but with questions. And perhaps the most painful of those questions was this: what had it all been for? The promised paradise never arrived. Jerusalem had changed hands, but the poor were still poor, the sick still died young, and the world remained as violent and fractured as ever. The ordinary men and women who had walked barefoot across continents, who had starved, fought, bled, and prayed, returned. Those who did return, with nothing but scars and ghosts. The dream of spiritual glory had dissolved into something far more mundane: power. Because, while the suffering was universal, the prophets were not. The First Crusade may have been launched with sermons and relics, but it ended in land grabs. European nobles didn't just reclaim holy sites, they claimed cities, castles, ports, and trade routes. The so-called Crusader states became fiefdoms carved into foreign soil, governed not by piety but by politics. Titles were handed out like coin. Fortresses were erected to protect wealth, not pilgrims, and taxes, steep, relentless taxes, were imposed on local populations who had never asked to be saved. For the knights and nobles who survived, the Crusades were a gamble that paid in power. For everyone else, they were a debt that could never be repaid. Merchants, however, saw opportunity, especially those from Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. They understood early on that war could be profitable if you sold to both sides. Ships that carried crusaders to the Holy Land also returned laden with spices, silk, sugar, and knowledge. Port cities flourished, trade exploded, and suddenly, faith had a price tag. Venice, in particular, grew rich not from fighting, but from facilitating the fight. Venetian merchants transported crusader armies. They negotiated deals with Muslim empires. They even helped sack Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, one of the most catastrophic betrayals in Christian history, not for God, but for gold. That infamous episode wasn't just a military disaster. It was a lesson in how quickly religion could be hijacked by capitalism. The church itself wasn't blind to the wealth pouring in. Indulgences, those spiritual passes sold to forgive sins, became an economy of their own. Crusade preachers promised not just heavenly reward, but earthly benefits, protection of property, legal immunity, even cancellation of debts. Participation in the Crusades wasn't just pious, it was financially strategic. This created a grotesque distortion of purpose. Men joined not to save their souls, but to save their estates. Nobles launched expeditions not to free Jerusalem, but to expand their landholdings. Popes authorized campaigns less for spiritual warfare and more for political leverage. The Crusades had become currency, traded, leveraged, manipulated. But if there were winners, there were many more losers. The economic burden of these wars fell squarely on the backs of Europe's poorest. Local communities were taxed to fund expeditions they had no voice in. Food was requisitioned, livestock seized. Fields left untended. Generations of peasants watched their fathers and sons march off in armor they couldn't afford, often never to return. For every noble who returned with a title, hundreds died in silence, buried in foreign soil or dumped into mass graves. And what of the cities that had been conquered? Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, these were not empty spaces awaiting salvation. They were vibrant, multicultural centers of art, learning, and commerce. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities had coexisted, uneasily at times, but coexisted nonetheless. The arrival of the Crusaders shattered that balance. Libraries were burned, mosques were desecrated, synagogues were destroyed with families still inside. Whole neighborhoods were wiped off the map. The Crusaders believed they were bringing light, but in reality they were extinguishing it, along with centuries of scholarship, architecture, poetry, and philosophy. Ironically, it was the very cultures they sought to destroy that would teach them the most. In the aftermath of conquest, many Crusaders encountered Arabic medicine, Greek philosophy preserved in Muslim libraries, advanced agricultural techniques, new mathematical systems, even perfumes, food preservation, and hygiene rituals that were entirely foreign to the West. These were not luxuries, they were revelations. The returning Crusaders didn't just bring back relics, they brought back knowledge. And that knowledge would help ignite the very movement that would, centuries later, challenge the Church's monopoly on truth, the Renaissance. It's one of history's cruel ironies that the same Crusades launched to crush infidels ultimately expanded the minds of the faithful. But not everyone was invited to share in this enlightenment. Women, for example, played critical but often invisible roles throughout the Crusades. They cooked, healed, washed, carried, mourned, endured. Some fought. Others were raped. Thousands were left behind as widows, their families shattered. And yet their stories remain largely untold. Not because they were unimportant, but because history, like war, has always favored the loudest swords. Children, too, bore the cost. They followed armies. They starved in camps. Some were dragged across continents in doomed crusades of their own. Most died anonymously, their bones lost in the dust of roads built on promises too big for their tiny bodies. Even the dead weren't spared dignity. In many cases, crusaders who died en route to the Holy Land were not buried with honor, but burned or dumped in rivers to avoid spreading disease. The graves of Muslim defenders were desecrated, bodies were mutilated, displayed, or left for vultures. Sanctity, it seemed, was reserved only for the few, and always for the victors. And yet, the myth persisted. In cathedrals across Europe, stained glass windows depicted noble warriors in perfect armor, halos glowing, swords raised against darkness. None of them showed lice, or dysentery, or women screaming as fire consumed their homes. The Crusades, in memory, became something they never were in reality, clean. But truth isn't clean, it's tangled, ugly, human. The real legacy of the Crusades is not found in the relics that sit behind glass in museums. It's not in the tourist brochures of Jerusalem or the ruins of ancient fortresses. It's in the enduring consequences of 2 centuries of relentless violence wrapped in divine permission. It's in the mistrust that still echoes between cultures, in the words we use, in the wounds we inherit. It's in the knowledge that when power wears the mask of faith, no one is safe. And the final tragedy? Many of those who gave their lives, those who walked, wept, fought, and died in the dust, never even understood what they were part of. They were told they were heroes, saints, soldiers of God. But they were pawns, moved across continents, sacrificed for empires, buried without names. And in the end, they didn't change the world. They became the soil beneath it. The last echo of battle faded. The last sword fell silent, and the last Crusader banner disappeared from the walls of Acre. The wars had ended, but their shadow had only begun to grow. Because history, unlike a battlefield, doesn't forget. It buries, it distorts, it reshapes. And what we inherit from the Crusades today isn't just a list of dates or names of battles. It's something far more dangerous. A legacy that still shapes how entire civilizations see themselves and each other. The Crusades were not just a medieval phenomenon. They became mythology. A mythology powerful enough to outlive the people who lived it, to outlast the blood, the famine, the cries. A mythology capable of being repurposed over and over again by kings, popes, tyrants, and ideologues any time the world needed a holy enemy. That's the dark genius of the Crusades. They didn't end, they just changed uniforms. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the idea of the crusade was no longer strictly bound to the Middle East. It had become a global permission slip. Christian Europe began using crusading rhetoric to justify campaigns against anyone deemed outside the faith. This included fellow Christians, the Orthodox in the East, the heretical sects of Central Europe, the pagans of the Baltic, and eventually the indigenous peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The cross became a flag under which kings sailed. The Pope no longer needed to preach in dusty fields. He sent bulls and blessings to colonizers and conquerors. When Spanish and Portuguese ships crossed the oceans, they carried steel, gunpowder, and the same script written centuries earlier. God is with us. Those who resist are savages. Conversion or death. Sound familiar? It should, because this framework, us versus them, sacred versus cursed, chosen versus damned, never truly went away. It simply adapted. It found its way into colonialism, into racial hierarchy, into nation-building and empire. The Crusades didn't stay in Jerusalem. They followed the ships to Mexico, to Brazil, to the Congo, to the Philippines. And just like in the Holy Land, it was the common people who paid the price. Whole civilizations were dismantled, libraries burned, languages erased, ancestors buried in unmarked graves. The same mechanisms of righteous violence that once shook the Levant were now shaking the globe. All because of a model born in medieval Europe, where power was wrapped in robes and guilt could be sold in the name of Christ. But if the West used the Crusades to expand, the East never forgot what it had endured. In Islamic lands, the memory of the Crusades remained sharp. It was preserved not just in history books, but in folklore, in cautionary tales, in cultural suspicion. The Crusaders weren't seen as misguided pilgrims. They were destroyers, invaders, desecrators. And this narrative, too, survived the centuries. In fact, in the modern world, the word crusade has become radioactive. Used carelessly, it can ignite outrage, even war. Politicians who invoke it, often without understanding its history, are playing with fire. Because in many parts of the world, it is not a metaphor. It is a historical trauma. One that shaped national identities, justified resistance, and, in many cases, gave birth to new movements. In the 20th and 21st centuries, extremists on both sides have invoked the memory of the Crusades to stir fear and justify violence. Radical Islamists frame modern geopolitical conflicts as a continuation of the Crusader invasion. Far-right nationalists in the West have embraced medieval imagery, calling themselves modern Templars, defenders of a so-called Christian civilization under threat. This isn't coincidence, it's inheritance. We are still living in the aftermath of the Crusades, whether we recognize it or not. The us versus them mindset, the holy war instinct, the habit of simplifying entire populations into good or evil, saved or damned, that all traces its roots to this medieval engine of belief and blood. And yet, perhaps the most tragic legacy of all is what was lost. Not just the lives, but the possibilities. Before the Crusades, there were moments, brief, fragile moments, where coexistence seemed possible, where Christian pilgrims visited Jerusalem under Muslim rule, where Jewish scholars, Muslim scientists, and Christian theologians debated in the same cities, where ideas, not swords, crossed borders. That fragile tapestry was torn apart, not only by war, but by the stories told afterward. Because memory, when controlled by power, becomes weaponized. The Crusades could have been remembered as a warning of what happens when faith is used to dominate, when difference becomes a death sentence, when salvation is sold by the sword. But they weren't. For centuries, they were remembered as glory. That false memory, clean, noble, righteous, still poisons us. It allows modern conflicts to borrow from ancient scripts. It allows hate to wear the mask of heritage. It allows us to ignore the human cost of dehumanization, because once you've told yourself your enemy isn't fully human, everything becomes justified. And this is the final, most dangerous legacy of the Crusades. Not the battles, not the relics, not even the ruins, but the belief that some people are chosen and others are obstacles, that some blood matters more than others, that God plays favorites. This belief is still alive. You can hear it in the language of politics, in the rhetoric of war, in the quiet prejudice that frames entire cultures as threats. It lives in textbooks, in museum plaques, in stained glass windows. It lives in our silence, in the stories we don't tell, in the questions we avoid. But maybe it doesn't have to stay that way. Maybe the true redemption of this story lies not in repeating it, but in confronting it, in refusing to look away from the bones beneath our beliefs, in honoring the unnamed, the broken, the forgotten, not as martyrs or heroes, but as humans who deserved more than sermons and steel. Because the real Holy Land was never a city. It was always the people walking toward it. And maybe the holiest act now is not conquest or conversion, but remembering them fully, so that we never again let faith be forged into a weapon without hearing the scream that comes after.